Boo! Welcome back to discussing Plato from a Marxist perspective this time. And it becomes important because the relationship between idealism, which is often thought to begin with Plato, and communism is actually historically contentious. Multiple people have it going back that far. And this not unproblematic doorstop of a mildly anti-communist book by former communist turned anti-communist Polish scholar Leszek Kołakowski. We begin communism with, I shit you not, Plotinus, which ties communism back to Plato. Now, I've had some Plotinus scholars on my show. I'll have them back on so we can talk about, the relationship there, but I do think that's interesting. Also, given that Marx is both profoundly rooted in Hegelian readings of ancient Greece, his dissertation, which I'm doing a show with Daniel Tutt on as I'm recording this, on the Anaximander and Democritus and the Epicureans, is part of where his particular notion of materialism comes from. It's kind of formal materialism. It is not the pure substance monism that you often deal with in, say, 20th century naturalist philosophy that's very mechanistic. So Plato was something that Marx dealt with, but he didn't write much about that. If you look at Marx's citations of ancient Greek philosophers, it's Democritus, Anaximander, and a whole lot of Aristotle. Aristotle shows up a lot, partly because Aristotle is also important to Smith and Ricardo. And, pretty much the Western scientific tradition until the 17th century was largely pulling from Aristotle. So Aristotle comes up, which leads us to ask, what were the Marxist responses to Plato? Now, I'm not going to go about the Marxist responses to Plato's text, and I'm not going to try to be exhaustive here because I don't think we really can be. You can't deal with philosophy, even if you're doing an anti-philosophical critique of philosophy or the history of idealism, without dealing with Plato, which means a whole lot of Marxists have written on Plato, although less than you might expect for some other philosophers that come up. Like if you look at the Marxist working bibliography on, say, Hegel, or even on Aristotle, you'll find a lot more. But I did want to bring this up before we go back into the text, and also it'll give me a chance to create a little division break, because I think knowing this will make some of the reception history when we talk about the different responses to Plato's Republic, the Statesman, and the Laws a little bit clearer. All right. So, Marxist and historical materialist interpretations of Plato generally treat his philosophy as a sophisticated ideological product rooted in the political and class struggles of ancient Athens and in Hellenic Greece. While Marxists recognize Plato's genius, almost anyone who's read Plato has to deal with that, particularly his proto-sociological insights into the division of labor and his want for a fundamentally different world than the one that exists. They view his philosophical system, especially his political utopianism, as a brilliant and maybe even progressively brilliant but reactionary defense of declining aristocracy against the rise of what was beginning to be a mercantile society that had traits that we would later call commercial capitalism, although reading commercial capitalism on ancient Greece is a bad idea. And perhaps something like democratic populism or proto-liberalism. Now, this claim is itself contested. How proto-liberal is the ancient Greek polis? Probably not very. Despite the fact that people like CLR James celebrated it, in general, I actually think that takes a lot of the myths about itself at face value. So we can deal with that at another time, and it's beyond the scope of this particular video, but it's something to note. So one of the most basic schools of reading Plato's Viewer and Marxism is by Alban Winspear, who wrote the Genesis of Plato's Thought. And he argues that the theory of forms and the reaction against the Sophists were intrinsically linked to an aristocratic background and aristocratic political alignment. And he talks about this, and particularly in regard with the disdain for the Sophists. The Sophists who taught justice and law were both conventional and relative, meaning that justice and law were based on the society you were in, and they were relative to that society. Were often aligned actually with the more democratic factions in Athens. Plato's insistence on an absolute, unchanging truth, known as physics, accessible only to a trained elite, was an ideological weapon against both democratic relativity and popular sovereignty. Plato also lived during a period of crisis for the Athenian theory state, as we talked about, marked by the defeats in the Peloponnesian War, the 30 Tyrants, the reestablishment and then second fall of democracy. And there was a massive destabilization of traditionally landed wealth by mercantile interest. Ironically, Socrates himself was one of those mercantile interests, but seems to have mostly sided with the elites, as we see by Critias and Alcibiades and Plato himself. Winspear argues that Plato's philosophies can basically be read as an attempt to restore order by naturalizing the authority of a ruling elite that does not depend on monetary wealth. So this is not so much an encyclical against proto-communism. In fact, there's some people who read Plato as basically having an aristocratic and top-down form of proto-communism, but as a stopping of a mercantile class from developing in a reactionary way. Now, some would say, like David Graeber, when he talked about Confucian anti-mercantile things, would read that as somehow proto-communistic. But Winspear argues that this is an anti-historical materialist point of view that confuses aristocratic disdain for mercantile development with something like proletarian distrust of capitalism. Now, Karl Marx himself actually also directly commented on this on Plato in Volume 1 of Capital. Marx appreciated Plato's analysis of the state and the republic because Plato correctly identifies a division of labor as foundational to the economic principles of society. But Marx notes that the historical difference between the classical Greek understanding and the capitalist understanding is profound, and that Plato, realizing this, was still in defense of a reactionary order. This is a quote from Capital, Volume 1. Plato's Republic, insofar as the division of labor is treated as a formative principle of the state, is a merely Athenian idealization of the Egyptian system of caste. So this is both a critique and a recognition of Plato's originality, that Plato is aware of something crucial to the political economy, aka relations of production, but that it is very much rooted in reactionary, aka ancient Egyptian notions of class and self. Marx also points out that Plato's views of division of labor are from the standpoint of use value alone. Plato argues that individuals should specialize because work is done better when a person focuses on a craft for which they are naturally suited, leading to higher quality goods, not because there needs to be a valorization of surplus value, which makes sense because we're not in a capitalist society yet. Capitalist political economy focuses on exchange value and abstract labor, and thus focuses on efficiency, using the division of labor to maximize the quantity of commodities and extracting surplus value, even if it degrades the worker's work and their soul, which is something that Plato really didn't like. So the other thing that has often been commented on by Marxists is that Plato's myth of the metals, aka the noble lie or the royal lie, depending on which version of Plato that you read, is cited by Marxists as an explicit, self-conscious, and deliberate blueprint for creating an ideology to justify class stratification. It is in some ways the form of a philosophical ideological justification. All right, it's a myth. It's not real, but an entire philosophical system depends on the acceptance of this myth. In the Republic, Plato suggests telling citizens they were formed in the earth from different metals in their souls, gold for rulers, silver for soldiers, auxiliaries, bronze for husbandmen and craftsmen, etc., is a way to naturalize divisions. And Plato knows it's false, and that's why he wants to kick the poets out, because the poets are inventing noble lies, but he only wants his good lie to be told. I think that a lot of Marxists see this as a quintessential and primary and one of the earliest articulated examples of this myth being explicit. It's not that Plato's the first example of inequalities and caste systems and relations of production being justified by a myth. You see that in all kinds of religions. It's that Plato says that's what he's going to do, and it's explicit. So, there's some key things you could read. Maybe we talked about Winspear's view, but there's also Ellen Meiksins Wood and Neil Wood's Class Ideology and Ancient Political Theory from 1978, where Woods provides a rigorous historical-materialist critique locating Plato at a specific social relations of the Athenian polis. And they argue that Plato's political philosophy is designed to systemically disenfranchise the productive classes, particularly peasants and artisans, and insulate state power from popular pressure, thus echoing Alban Winspear's earlier work from 1940, The Genesis of Plato Thought, which does the same. Although Winspear does it particularly through tracking the oligarchical factions, particularly ones associated with Socrates. We talked about Critias and Alcibiades, and the Pythagoreans, versus the democratic factions, which were also often aligned with the Sophists. So the attacks on the Sophists, according to Winspear, are also not innocent, as I said before. Now, there are some defenses of Plato in the Marxist tradition, Alain Badiou being the most recent one. So, I have often joked that Alain Badiou is Maoist Rib Platonism, and I don't take it back. I respect Badiou. I actually quite like a lot of Badiou's work, but he reads Plato radically differently than almost everyone else in the Marxist tradition. And this is very clear in his 2012 book on Plato's Republic. So, though heterodox Marxist philosopher, Badiou approaches Plato differently by writing a hyper translation of the Republic. Badiou attempts to rescue Plato from the liberal critique, such as Karl Popper's view of Plato as a proto-fascist, by interpreting the philosopher king not as a totalitarian despot and not as a way to remove popular sovereignty, but as a radical figure representing the rule of universal truth over the corrupting influence of private property and market dynamics. Now, my critique of Badiou in this book is the critique I made at the time, and that is that it conflates aristocratic disdain for markets with proletarian contradictions around it. I find this problematic in the extreme because there's all kinds of there's contempt for mercantilism across the board. It's the same thing as when David Graeber says the Confucian Yunban class was somehow anti-capitalist when capitalism wasn't even developed yet, particularly in East Asia, because they were distrustful of merchants and tried to keep them down. That's aristocratic privilege. You're confused in being ahistorical. But I think there's something to Badiou's method that requires Platonic idealism to sort of function. So there's an attempt to kind of save Badiou by having universal truths being above and beyond what the function is. And in other words, it's a return to idealism in my mind. And while I like a lot of Badiou's work, I find this to be dangerous and historically anachronistic. Now, I'm sure many of Badiou fans will have all kinds of defenses of this, and you're welcome to make them in the comments. I'm not going to get mad. But this is an interesting thing to think about. So let's go into this a little bit more. So, while I can talk about the hyper translation of the Republic, which is, for all intents, a deliberate correction, that is almost ideological one. I think we need to talk about Badiou's distrust of modern sophistry and his anti-Platonism, which which he got from anti-communism, which I have never found to be a particularly useful framework. Being anti something is a way to just replicate a bunch of errors, but nonetheless. I do think Badiou is interesting because he's pretty much the most distinctive engagement with Plato, and one that tries to tie it back into his view of communist philosophy. He seems particularly motivated against disproving Karl Popper, and I'm going to talk about Karl Popper's interpretation of Plato later, but basically he calls Plato proto-fascist. Ironically, somewhat similar to the aristocratic readings of Plato that you see in most Marxist readings in historiography. Badiou sees Plato as an ally to communism, which I find wild. For Badiou, Plato is a philosopher who understood philosophy as conditioned by truths, specifically mathematical truths, which is also something that moves Badiou, and sought to protect the radical nature of that truth from the relativism of the sophist. Now, you will notice this is a completely different reading than one that most historical Marxists prior to Badiou have given. And this means that Badiou argues that contemporary postmodern analytic philosophers suffer from an anti-Platonic bias because of their reliance on absolute truths. He contends that modern culture is dominated by democratic materialism that claims that there are only bodies and languages except that there are truths. Modern sophists argue that truths are relative, cultural constructs are language games. Badiou tries to use Plato to reassert that truths are eternal, universal, and indifferent to culture or opinion, which I think has nothing to fucking do with Marxism at all. Yes, we do believe in the scientificity of our claims, and we do actually say that there's probably something like genus being or species being or whatever that are somewhat transhistorical, but Marx and Marxism has generally been very weary of making transhistorical truths because history conditions everything. So Badiou using Plato for to assert the truths are eternal and universal as some kind of truth of which we're approaching has always just baffled me as a way to go about defending a Maoist form of communism. The other thing that Badiou pulls from Plato is mathematicity, although Plato's mathematics aren't obvious to us because they're so geometric and not algebraic. Badiou heavily emphasizes the famous, although probably apocryphal, to be quite honest, inscription over Plato's Academy, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." Badiou argues that Plato correctly recognizes that mathematics is the baseline of ontic thought of being, because it abstracts away the sensory world. And Badiou's own system on ontology is mathematics, specifically set theory, which has its own set of problems that Badiou kind of ignores, a move that he traces directly back to Plato's separation of the intelligible realm from the sensible realm. And you can find this in 1988's Being an Event, particularly in Meditation 3 and his theoretical writings in 2004. Also, Badiou uses Platonism in a kind of interesting way. So he reinterprets the Platonic idea with our form, which is a static, eternal type. Badiou reinterprets the Platonic idea through his concept of the event, which he got from Heidegger. For Badiou, an idea is what allows an individual to become as a subject to the truth procedure, whether it is in politics, art, science, or love. And the idea is not a transcendent object up in the heavens. It is a conceptual framework that makes a radical, localized historical truth universal. And this universal accessibility happens through its eventual politics. And this is articulated in Logical Worlds, the sequel to Being an Event, and also the concept of the model, which was originally written in 1969, but it was rewritten and re-released with a new preface in 2007. Badiou also argues that Plato's Parmenides is probably one of the most important works. He argues that this is important because it deals with the one and the many. Badiou claims that Plato came to the very brink of modern set theory in this dialogue, which I think is frankly horseshit. I think Badiou is basically using Plato as a hand puppet. Badiou argues that Plato's conclusion that if the one is not, nothing is, implies that the one is not a being, but an operation, which I also think is horseshit. I have said very nice things about Badiou's political writings. I tend to think Badiou's philosophical writings are idiosyncratic in the extreme, and I don't know how they got linked to Marxism other than Badiou's personal politics. All right, and you can find this argument also in Being an Event. Now, I'm not going to go into the super deep arguments about Badiou's mathematical readings of Parmenides because I don't think it's sound. But I do want people to know that I know it exists. But I want to go back to a more traditional reading, which is Meiksins Wood. Now, I see Meiksins Wood developing the theory that was often beheld by the Soviets and by Alan Winspear as probably the more conventional reading of Plato from a Marxist account, although one that is not as popular right now because these books are older and popularity tends to be cyclic to trends and academia, sadly. Just a reminder of who Alan Meiksins Wood was, although I've probably mispronouncing your name, I definitely mispronounced it in the past. She was a prominent Marxist historian and one of the key figures along with Robert Brenner in the political Marxist movement. Alan Meiksins Wood is a iconoclastic but class-based critique of classical Greek philosophy, and who attempts to try to ground them in a historical, material, and structural account of the Athenian polis. So one of the first things she asserts is, similar to Winspear, that Plato was an aristocratic counter-reaction to the beginnings of free labor. She particularly works this out in a book called The Peasant-Citizen and Slave, a book that I really like, actually. Wood argues that true revolutionary features of Athenian democracy were not just a presence of, we're not just hampered by the presence of slavery, but also did entail an unprecedented liberation of the peasantry from something akin to serfdom and high tributary relationships to lords. This did create a peasant citizen, an ordinary manual labor who possessed equal political rights and a vote in mass meetings, even though they were a small part of the population, because most of the citizens were actually, a lot of the inhabitants of Athens were actually slaves. But this was an expansion of political sovereignty. And it allowed people like Socrates to exist because these peasant citizens also gained access to elites and their participation in the armed forces of the ancient Greek polis. Woods argues that the major works of Greek philosophy, particularly Plato, were aristocratic counterreactions to this democratic impulse. Plato and a lot of other intellectuals that we might anachronistically call right-wing. It is anachronistic, though, because we don't have the right and left in politics as anything cohesive until at least the French Revolution. Were deeply traumatized by a system where the poorest farmers had some political authority as wealthy landowners, and that authority was equalized, even formally, even if it wasn't informally, and even if there were still masses and masses of slaves. Thus, Plato's philosophy was designed to concoct theories to justify hierarchy and inequality against what may be deemed a proto-left in the ancient world, which is demands of debt cancelization and land redistribution and the weakening of aristocratic elites. Woods also offers a provocative reading of Plato's epistemology in Citizens and Lords. She links Plato's theory of forms directly to the division of labor in the polis, picking up from Marx, as I mentioned earlier. Plato implies that the aristocrat is fit the rule because he is free from the burden of manual specific labor, allowing him to contemplate the universal and abstract. Wood argues that this elevation of the permanent intellectual form over its flawed material counterpart is an idealized reflection of a class split between the intellectual activity of appropriators, aka the nobility of the Hellenes, and a manual labor of direct producers who were peasants. We might think of them as a proto-working class. Not true. They're not a working class in the way we Marxists would mean by it, but nonetheless. Woods also argues that Plato takes this structural division between the laboring classes and the ruling classes and anchors it permanently into human nature by writing into the psychology of the soul and the Republic in particular. And we're going to talk about Wood's interpretation of the Republic. Because Plato structures the soul hierarchically, asserting that the higher rational and spiritual elements must command the baser, more appetite-driven and sensual elements. Now, many people read this as the political metaphor for the soul, but honestly, Wood inverts that and says, no, it's a spiritual metaphor for political reality. And she goes on to, in my mind, pretty much prove that this psychological hierarchy serves a direct political function. It makes political inequality eternal and innate, making the rule of enlightened oligarchy over the working masses seem naturally oriented. Wood also highlights that Plato's sharp opposition to the democratic premise that political virtue and governance are traits that any ordinary citizen can learn to possess is pretty profound. Pointing to dialogues like Protagoras, she shows that Plato uses Socrates to ironize and mock the idea that common craftsman or a farmer has the capacity for statecraft. For Plato, governance requires a specialized transcendent knowledge and episteme only available to a few, which, a lot of liberals believe, even when they talk about democracy. Directly undercutting any democratic assertion that the community of free labor can rule itself. And the books you want to look at for this are Woods's Class Ideology and Ancient Political Theory, Peasant-Citizen and Slave, The Foundations of Athenian Democracy, and Citizen to Lords, Social History of Western Political Thought from Antiquity to the Late Middle Ages. So I think you have this very clear contrast between the Badiouian idealization of communism as an eternal truth to which we are arriving, that he sees in Plato, and a more materialist reading of Plato. All these are available to Marxists as readings, although I would say the vast majority of them are closer to Woods and Winspear than they are to Badiou's, although there are the people who try to situate Plato in the more radical end of this tradition. A lot of them are liberals, not Marxists, and I will talk about them when we get to different interpretations of the Republic. I'm going to put the books I referred to here in the show notes, and protect your peace. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. You'll find more behind the paywall at the Patreon, which you can gain access to for as limited as $4. And if you don't want to do that, you can leave a comment, write a review of my podcast, which is available on most fine podcast feeds, although this is not. This is only available behind the Patreon wall. And if you don't want to watch the video, I give the audio to my patrons. Otherwise, you're going to watch it through the video. But anyway, we are going to take a brief break from these 2 episodes on Plato and come back to him in a couple weeks and go into probably the Republic. And then I might do the Statesman. I'm still going back and forth on that. And then we'll do the laws. Now, there's other political implications and other Platonic dialogues. I'm not going to get to them all. I'm going to focus on the ones that are explicitly political. All right. Protect your peace. And don't stop learning about the past so that you can understand the future.